So now that we're putting fluids in, it's going to be time to fire up the motor. This motor's been sitting on a stand assembled for a while, although we do always assemble everything with assembly lube and things like that. And when I'm firing a motor for the first time, I really like to pre-oil them if I have the opportunity to do so. So we have a Melling engine pre-oiler. So you put your engine oil in, or half of it or so that you intend to run, and you pressurize this tank, and it actually runs in via a -4 line. So this, I'm actually going to be entering oil into the motor in two different ways. I'm actually going to enter it in via the HKS Vcam line, and I'm also going to put it in through the turbo feed. So my goal here is to obviously get oil throughout the motor and pre-oil it so that during startup we're going to have oil where it needs to be. A main thing is when you're first starting a motor, it's really difficult to get prime on the oil pump a lot of times. So I've had situations in the past with 2Js specifically where the oil pump didn't prime very well, and we actually had to use vacuum to suck it up the pickup tube the first time. That was even with assembly lube in the pump. So if I can pre-oil, not only is it going to go in and get down into the backside or the inlet side, the low pressure side of the pump, but it's also going to force up into the cam journals, in through the crank, and get all my bearing journals lubricated, as well as forcing out some of that initial assembly lube. So we like to pre-oil engines, and I'm going to go ahead and get that hooked up and we'll get it pre-oiled here. So in this case, we're going to be using Motul 8100X Clean. This is really just going to be to initial fire the motor, get some of the assembly lubes out of there, get any sort of unforeseen contaminants or anything that has accumulated along the way out. This will only be about a 2 or 3 minute run time. It will dump it. We're going to cut the filter, check that out, make sure that there's no seriously large particles or anything like that. Then we'll go in with our more permanent oiling setup. The other thing too, depending on the viscosity, if it's a cold day, a lot of times it's cold in the shop, I'll actually preheat this oil a little bit with a torch on the outside of the container. Not much, just make it warm to the touch so it just migrates a little bit easier through the oil passages. Sometimes too, I'll use the oil with UV dye in it so that if there are any leaks, we can look for them right away under a black light. So these tanks have a pop-off valve at like 50 PSI. So I'll fill the tank to 50. You'll feel the release valve, so you start hearing the relief valve at about 50 PSI. That's just a safety valve so you can't over pressurize these tanks. That's about 50 PSI. So then I'll pull the oil cap. Gonna wait to see if we can see some oil coming out of those journals. Some people do this with the valve covers off just so that it's easier to see the migration of oil coming out, make sure that you're hitting those marks. But a lot of times you got visibility, and these cars aren't the easiest thing to get a valve covers off, but certainly not convenient in this car. But I'll be able to see it come up through. And the other thing is wondering if it'll backflow this valve and come out here. Just right now we got oil flowing. At some point we'll see it either come out here, ouchie, or the journals. It's likely not, because after here it just falls away. So this is a pressure input that then goes to the control solenoid that goes through and activates the phaser, and then any excess oil just runs back. So I typically use like a driven assembly grease. And I like it because if you know you're going to have a motor on a stand for some time, you're not going to have an opportunity to put it together or get it running right away. the more long-term solution for assembly is to use a grease. There are, sort of time limitations to that as well, but if you use a grease, it tends to hang on to those journals a little bit better and over a wider range of temperatures and storage. So, the goal is always, if you have a motor, it's, keep it in a bag with a desiccant pouch, something to pull the moisture out of the air, in a relatively cool place so that the assembly grease doesn't fall away, but it's better than nothing. See, the other cool thing is that this line, since it's 1/8 inch NPT, can double as an output feed for a mechanical gauge. So you pre-fill the motor, make sure everything's good, and then during initial cranking you can use just a standard 0 to 100 psi gauge there in order to confirm you have oil pressure. In most cases we prefer to have like a pressure transducer fed into the ECU so that we know what the oil pressure is live all the time, but not everybody opts to have that sensor package. We do have a factory gauge in the GTRs, but they're notoriously bad or inaccurate. We may have run down on pressure. There's still some, not nearly as much as before. Close that pop-off safety. So we're going to want to listen for what the level is, feel the tank, feel how much oil you have in there, sort of like feeling the level on a propane tank. Make sure you have physical liquid oil in the bottom. You don't really want to be pushing air where you just did your pre-prime, so you want to try to cut it off before that's before that happens. I am seeing liquid oil flow at the cams, so that's good. And I am not seeing liquid oil flow on the ground, which is also good. So we've got oil coming into the motor, going in the places it's supposed to go. I'm a happy boy. Filling up our lifter areas. We don't have lifters in this. It's a shimless bucket, but for argument's sake, we'll just refer to them as lifters right now. But yeah, guy. Yeah, guy. Oh yeah, dude. So if you can see down in here, see that pool of oil down in there. Anyway, so there's a pool of oil in there. You'll just have to take my word for it. That's good. Good. That makes me happy, boy. And we're gonna feel for level again. Getting pretty low. We just don't want to be pushing air, so we're gonna feel for it, listen for it. Some guys will stop it early, but it's really hard to get the oil out of this thing clean, so if I could push it all out under force, then the better. And these pre-oilers are not expensive, right? It just looks like it's like a mini keg, right? They've repurposed the thing. It's just a mini keg that's welded and it has a threaded top or whatever. And you just pre-oil it with oil that you intend to use, pressurize it up, and it sends it out. But they're like, I don't know, $100 or something like that, and it's so worth it. For instance, there we go. So I can start feeling some bullshit going in there. For instance, we just did an Evo 10 motor. Came right from Mitsubishi. There was not a drop of grease or assembly lube or anything in this motor. Came dry. And we pre-oiled that engine, and I've heard of a lot of guys getting those motors from Mitsubishi. They're like between $6,000 and $7,000, and they fire them up and they're like, yeah, I had an engine failure in 200 miles, and I don't know why. Now Mitsubishi doesn't state that you need to do anything or whatever. I mean, maybe there's some sort of internal company memo that says like, hey, like pre-oil these things, but otherwise these guys put these expensive, factory long blocks in their cars, and they fire it up and it's done in 200 miles. Just gulls out the journals and it's ruined. The whole thing's ruined. So for $100, if you got a lot of money into an engine, even moderate money into an engine, just get a pre-oiler. I mean, it honestly is a very nice, easy, clean process. As long as you have some sort of an external feed line or a way to plumb the oil into the motor, it's just a really good way to do it. So we'll relieve the pressure, the excess pressure on there. I have a little bit of oil in here, but I was pushing air and I don't want to push air into the system, so. You definitely want to depressurize these things before you pull this top off, because what doesn't feel like a lot of pressure on a small diameter is quite a bit when you've got a full 1 inch, you know. So if you got 10 or 20 pounds of air in there on a 1 inch bore, you're talking about 25, 30 pounds of pressure coming at your hand. It'll blow this thing right into your face, blow vaporous oil all over the place, make a huge mess. So definitely depressurize those things. I see guys do it a lot with these too. They go to empty these things and, you know, it's just this like eruption. Makes great content for those fail pages, but you don't want to be that guy. We got the I don't trust gauges double redundancy setup. So 2 gauges, 1 cup, no, 2 gauges, 1 line. Yuck. I don't trust. This is called the Trust Issues 9000. 2 gauge. So many gauge. Now, having this Vcam line here, very convenient. I like that a lot. So now we put, we start with a fresh container, so I can measure how much we put in there. Let's go ahead and put our initial throwaway oil in it. To some people, it may seem silly to like do an initial fill and dump, but I promise you that it's not. It's cheap insurance. You can learn a lot from it. You can track what sort of contaminants are in it. You know, if you use like ARP Molly Lube, that has grit in it. The reason that it works is that it has grit. It allows air a pathway to get out so that it's not, you know, it's not like tightening down on pure oil or grease. That's why they use it. So it has grit in it. And I like to see like, is that stuff coming out in the oil? Is it present or is it still stuck in the motor somewhere? I'm going to turn the injectors off in the ECU. And then we're going to do a crank prime test. It's likely that this battery is poo-poo. Yeah, so I'm going to get a laptop, turn the injectors off, get ready for a crank prime. I could probably also, yeah, you know what, I could do that. Yeah, I could just pull power to the injectors by pulling the resistor pack jumper, because that's how the injectors are powered. Like that. There we go, no injectors. Do it again. Okay. Oh yeah. All right, so we got lots of nice oil up into the thing. We're doing the things. We got pressure. Good, good. About 40 PSI at idle. I have the plugs out, obviously, in order to make it easier to crank. Okay, cooling system. We're filling up the cooling system on this car. I like to do 2 tests prior to the initial fill. So what I'll do is I'll pull it under vacuum, confirm that I don't have a pressure drop test. Then I'll pressurize the system because it's always easier to pressurize and look for a leak before you have coolant in there potentially spraying out of whatever leak you might have. Then I go back to the vacuum test. Now you could do it in the opposite way, but I like to just do my thing my way, okay? So when it comes to filling cooling systems, we used to suffer with the buckets and all that stuff for a long time. There are some cars where you will still have to finish up with a bucket, but more often than not, we do our initial cooling system fill with a vacuum filler. So this is by a company called AirLift. Started using these for Porsche because they're impossible to get filled the appropriate way without evacuating the air. Since then, we use it on everything. The times where this doesn't work very well is when the system is half full of coolant, because you'll pull a vacuum, a partial vacuum, and then it starts sucking coolant in. It makes a humongous mess. It's terrible. These are fantastic to fill from a completely dry system. So basically what we're doing is, this is a valved piece with a vacuum gauge on it. We use a Venturi. So like this Venturi valve goes on, air pressure comes in here. Venturi's vacuum out of this port that evacuates all the air in the system. And we have a vacuum gauge, typically like 27, 26 inches of vacuum. that thing's sealed up good. So then we unclick that. It's got a dry brake fitting here. And then what we do is when it comes time to fill the coolant up, we put it into our basin. We like to use these 5-gallon water cooler jugs after we're done using them. They're nice because you can see through them, and they're chemical resistant, so with coolant it's not going to break them down. So we hook up the dry brake fitting, confirm that we have good vacuum, confirm that the tip is in the water, because what will happen is you'll suck it down and then you suck air and you lost your prime, and then it's impossible to redo the prime again. So then it's just do it this way. Okay, so then that sucks the coolant in and displaces the vacuum inside of the system. So the beauty is like after this is done, the system is bled. There's no jacking the car up 20 feet in the air and revving it and trying to get air bubbles out. Like, it's done for the most part. Sometimes, depending on the system, depending on the difference in height between the radiator and the engine or the high point of the engine, we will end up putting a bucket in there just to sort of bleed out that last little bit, or at least confirm, but we usually get very few bubbles. We just like to double down on the bleeding process if possible. But yeah, otherwise, this is really straightforward. The nice part is too, is if you take all your coolant, you put it in a 5-gallon jug, you don't run into that situation where you suck the initial coolant or a gallon in, you got to switch the hose, and then you're introducing more air into the system. Just pour everything into a centralized jug. We also buy concentrate, and then we water it down with distilled water only. So now we're approaching the bottom here, vacuum, and you'll see the hoses come back. They're not sucked in anymore. And then what you can do is basically, when you see any sort of air migrating in here, then you know that you're neutral vacuum. So I'll close this no matter what. Close this as well. Open this up, no drips. Then I'll pick up my hose, remove the prime, and all excess goes back into the system. There's like no drips, no mess. It's fantastic. I'm not sponsored. I already own the tool. Just buy one. They're cheap. Yeah, maybe $100 and something bucks, but like, it's sick, man. You'll never want to pour coolant in a jug ever again. Obviously, when you're struggling out in the field or you're at an event or something like that, it is what it is. But man, like, if you can get the stuff done in the shop with the appropriate tools, just do that. There it is. Amazon, eBay, OTC tool, whatever. Just go and buy one. They're freaking great. The cooling system, she is full. There it is. Right up to the brim. We'll put a generic amount in there, something like day. It's probably gonna tip over. Use the bucket to put a little bit in this jug over here. That's at the max line. Use a little bit. Of course, Koyo. Come on, Koyo. This is just filling the last little top section of the radiator. It's like just this top layer. There usually is a little bit of spring in the hoses, so as you release the thing, it'll pull a little bit of air in, but get that last little tidbit. Oh, to the brim. This last little squirt in here. And then the other thing is too, you can use the hose. See this? Use the hose, bring it right up to the level. Then you put your Johnson in here. And then what it'll do is if it pulls back, it sucks the fluid out of the reservoir. Truly no air. Ah, perfect. Dude, we got our garage hacked in. Frickin' thingamabob. Bye-bye.